it's okay, because some of this, it doesn't hurt to hear more than once, I hope. So welcome. Thank you for coming to Time Out. I am still Becky Goldsmith, for those of you who were with me. The quilt behind me is Everyday Best from Quilts with a Spin. You can get the ebook or e-pattern on the website. Math. Not a fan. I am not a fan. I've never been a fan. I think I got the last bachelor's degree from the University of Oklahoma in 1978, where math was not a requirement. I got to escape. I've never had math beyond geometry. I've had arithmetic. I'm good at arithmetic. Quilter's math is basically arithmetic. And really seriously, if I can do it, you can do it. The first place to start, and this is good because it never hurts to go back and hear this again for those of you who heard this once before, it's to make that cheat sheet. And once you make it, you can keep hold of it and, put it in a place where you'll find it again. Watch and see how to do it. It's a really good way to start a calculation day because it starts to get your brain to working in that space. Here we go. Before I begin, I make myself a cheat sheet. And what I include is the fractions that we as quilters use most often: eighth, quarter, third, 3/8, etc. And then I convert those to their digital selves. And the way you do that, in case your math skills have atrophied somewhat since grade school, is that you divide whatever's on top by whatever's on bottom. So 1 divided by 8 is 0.125. And then what I do is take this number times 36 to find out how many inches are in an eighth of a yard. Now, some of you may just have all this information floating around in your head. I don't. I wish I did, but I don't. When I've been doing a lot of calculations, yeah, sometimes I can pull this up, but in between, not so much. One of the things I find helpful by doing this and just keeping this handy is that when I'm running other numbers, it's easy to look at the number of inches that I need, and I can convert pretty quickly back to the yardage I would be either pulling from my stash or going to buy. So make yourself a cheat sheet to start. Okay, I'm back. Now, you've got your cheat sheet. You're thinking math-like thoughts. Then you got to think about what it is you're going to make, right? Have you found a photograph of something you want? Do you know you just want to do 9 patches with snowballs? You got to think about what you want. There is a good place to look that has information. I'm just going to show you. Here it comes. You'll see this. If you're building a quilt from scratch, this is a nice tool to have. It's handy because you can go in and it gives you all these different pictures of blocks, and it also breaks them down into whether they're a 2 grid, like a 4 patch, or a 3 grid, like a 9 patch, or a 4 grid, which would be a 16 patch. That can be really helpful. And in the book, it does give you cutting information and yardage amounts. For me, for this to be helpful, I have to be in the right frame of mind. I have to sit and think it through to really see what they're telling me. And I can do that. And you can do that too. We can all do that. And there's good information in the back, general information, that is handy to have, especially the mattress sizes and the yardage you might need for a variety of different sizes of squares and rectangles. This is all good, but what I find is it's less specific than I need it to be when I'm designing a quilt for which there isn't a pattern with specific instructions. So this is a really handy tool to have on hand, but it won't be the only thing you need. Okay, so for a lot of you, you may never have made a quilt without a pattern. You might have thought about it. You might have tried to alter a pattern and just sort of taken a stab at the yardage, or even the calculations for how to figure out what it is you want to make. But it's a really liberating experience. And when I was a new quilter, I want to make sure that's the next video that's coming up. It is. When I was a new quilter, I went to work for a very small quilt shop on the north side of Tulsa called Ma Ward's. And I was Marilee's only employee. I was her teacher. I was her sample maker. And she got this book. This was a new book back in the day. And it's a marvelous book. And she wanted a whole bunch of quilts made from this book. And there were no patterns. And it was my job to make the quilts from scratch, and I was new. So it was interesting. It was the best training I ever had this is excellent training. So let me show you about the book. As I said, this is the book that made me learn to calculate yardage. It's written by Rachel and Kenneth Pellman it was in the 80s. I think it was 84. Yep, in 1984. And back in the day, and it still is. I don't know if you can still get it. It's a wonderful book. It's historical, but it shows all different kinds of Amish quilts. And as I said, the shop owner, Marilee, where I was working, she had gutcheon solids, and she wanted quilts made to go with them from this book. No patterns, so I had to calculate. When I say I had to, she asked me if I would, and I said yes. Make all kinds of quilts, and I did. And I didn't get to keep the quilts. I made these. It was part of my job. But I was a pretty new quilter then, and I had to calculate not just the yardage, but figure out how to put these things together. And I strip-pieced a lot. But what I learned was that every quilt breaks down into specific units, and if you have the measurement for one of those units, you can sort it out. You really can. For example, these are 9 patches, but they're not really double 9 patches because each of these squares is a 4 patch. So it's like a 4 patch, 9 patch, which is kind of fun. If the squares in the 4 patches are 1 inch, then that makes that a 2-inch square, and that makes that a 2-inch square. And that makes this 2, 4, 6. That makes that a 6-inch square. That's pretty small. So if I was looking at this and I thought, well, do I really want to make it that small? Yeah, I could, but I might rather have these be 1.5 inches. So if that's 1.5 and that's 1.5, this is 3. That's a 3-inch square. So is this. That makes this a 9-inch block total. That could be good. And if you're kind of guessing, all right, so if that is a 3-inch square, the sashing is 3 inches. All right, so then you're starting to get these sizes, but it's set on point. How do you calculate that? Well, there's a formula for that, and I'll share that with you. You can look, and this sashing is not as wide as this, so that's maybe a 2-inch wide sashing. And then you guess this is maybe, that might actually be 9 inches. That looks almost as wide as a block. on the sides, but it's less wide top and bottom. That's not that hard, right? All right, so how would I go about calculating, say, the number of strips and the yardage for inside these blocks? I will show you that shortly. Okay, so you start with the big picture that can be off-putting, and then you bring it in and bring it in and bring it in until you begin to calculate individual parts of whatever it is you want to make. I'm not sure I said this this time, but I am presuming here that you understand the construction process that you're going to use. If you're going to do this with strip piecing on the machine, okay, that's one way to construct the quilt. If you were going to cut individual pieces and hand piece it, that's something different. There's different ways you can construct it, and you think about the yardage with that in mind and the cutting. So before I sit down to actually put pencil to paper, I really do grab my very fine pencils and I sharpen them really sharp, and I keep my sharpener handy because this is like, the pencils are, it's not the candy part of the process, but it's the part of the process that I can hold on to and enjoy while I'm doing the numbers, which I tolerate. So here we go. Let's look at it closer, how you actually think through numbers. Since this is not my favorite job, I do what I can to make it more fun. Part of that is using a very nice pencil. This is my Blackwing pencil. It says half the pressure, twice the speed. That's good because, you know, math. And I've sharpened it to a beautiful point with my one-step sharpener. Now, I'm ready. I'm really ready. Let's start with an easy piece, which would be the black squares inside the 9 patch. There are how many 9 patches? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. There's 18 of those blocks. So of the 9 patches, there are 18 blocks. Inside each of the blocks, there are black squares. There's 4 of them per block. Okay, so 4 times 18 equals, this is when I use my trusty calculator, 4 times 18, there's 72. I need 72 of those. So I could even write over here, 72 black squares. Now the reason you want to leave good notes to yourself here is because if you're like me, you might end up with a page full of calculations and it's hard to figure out which ones are important. So here, 18 blocks, that's important. You need 72 black squares. To figure out how much yardage you need, let's think this through. You'll probably be cutting these from strips that are 40 inches wide, because fabric is basically 40 inches wide. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes a little more, but mostly 40 inches, and that would be after washing and shrinking. So you've got 40-inch width fabric. That's a given. You know these are finished 3 inches, so you're cutting 3 1/2 by 3 1/2. Doesn't hurt to have that there. You want to know how many 3.5-inch squares you can get per 40-inch strip. So you divide by 3.5. So 40 divided by 3.5 is 11.42. Really, you can only get 11 of those per strip. So you can get 11 squares per strip. you need 72 squares. So if you need 72 squares divided by 11, because you can only get 11 per strip, now you want to know how many strips you need. So 72 divided by 11 is 6.5. Well, you're not going to cut a half a strip, so you're going to need 7 strips. All right, those 7 strips are going to be 3.5 inches wide. So you won't go to the quilt shop and say, please cut me 7 strips 3.5 inches wide. You're going to say, I need X number of yards. So to find out how much yardage you need just of those black squares, you would take 7 times 3.5 equals 7 times 3.5. You need 24.5 inches. 24.5 inches of black for the squares. You know, when you look at the quilt, you don't think to yourself, wow, you don't think it would be that much, which is why it's important to do these calculations. Then you want to look at your little cheat sheet. If we look at this, it's more than 2/3 of a yard. It's getting close to 3/4. So 24.5, you could get it out of 3/4 of a yard. If your yardage doesn't shrink too much and if it's cut relatively straight on the grain. But you know how sometimes you get yardage and it's cut all wonky and you lose an inch or two to either side, plus you're going to lose to shrinkage. So if you look at the difference, if it was me, I'd bump that up to 7/8 of a yard. 7/8, but you may not be me. You may want less than that. 7/8 of a yard just for the black squares. Every one of these shapes is calculated exactly the same way. You figure out what size you need to cut, figure out how many of them you can get out of a 40-inch width, see how many strips you need, and so on. What if you're doing a scrap quilt? I'll talk about that next. Okay, there's a couple of things here that I don't want to forget to say. One of them is I write patterns. I calculate yardage and I put those calculations inside the books and patterns. I calculate big. I always calculate assuming people are going to wash their fabric and there will be shrinkage. And I calculate for those wonky cuts. I skew big. There are other pattern designers who would cut it closer to the bone. So if you get a pattern and you run short of fabric, this is kind of how this is how the sausage is made, right? Somebody somewhere ran these calculations and we have to decide, do we go big or do we go tight? That's also why if you buy a pattern and you get yardage instructions and you have more left than you might have thought you would, it's because someone like me wants to give you some extra, and it also covers in case you cut something wrong where someone else might not. So there's that. Then I was going to talk to you about scrap quilts. Okay, so let's say those black squares. If you were doing this scrappy and you didn't use just one black fabric, but you were using a lot of different black fabrics, you would have choices. You could get 72 different pieces of black fabric and cut your squares out of that. Or you could cut smaller strips. You could work off fat quarters rather than yardage that's longer. In all cases, it never hurts, even if that's the way you're going to do it, to calculate the total yardage so that you have some idea of how much scrap yardage you want to pull in. The other thing, that quilt, you probably noticed, there are other smaller black squares in there, and there's the corner triangles. I would go through and calculate all of the different things, and then when I calculate, say, the smaller black squares, I would add that yardage to this first yardage so that when I do buy it, I'm buying one chunk of whatever the color is rather than 3 separate pieces. Was that all I needed to tell you there? I think so. And I also think that that progression, of how you think through, it's remember where that is in the video if you decide you want to come back to this at some later point when you sit down and do the calculations. It's kind of nice to be walked through it. I know when I was walking my own self through it, I had to think it through as if it was a brand new idea because it's been a while since I've calculated yardage. All right, the next thing I want to show you is about the setting triangles. It's really not hard because there's a formula for that. To really figure out the size of your setting triangles, you need to know that length. And on this picture, you don't really know that length. What we know is this. We know this 9 inches. Now I can guess that that is going to be close to 6 inches. But let's just assume that it's smaller than 9, but maybe bigger than 6. So I'm going to call the number I know 7. I'm going to call that 7 inches. And then I'm going to look at this chart that I found online. If you go to allpeoplequilt.com, which is from American Patchwork and Quilting, and look for their setting triangle chart, this will come up. This is information that you can find in other places, but it's a really great chart. What this does is tell you for the size you know, and here I'm going to guess 7 inches. That's the size I know. To cut side triangles, I would cut an 11 1/4 inch square. Now, the reason that's a side triangle is because if you cut that square, then the bias edges end up next to the block, and that ends up on the outside edge of the quilt top, which is where you want the straight of grain. You definitely want the straight of grain here. So for a side setting triangle, that's it. If my corner triangles butted up against a 7-inch block, I would cut the corner triangles 5 7/8 and cut them in half on the diagonal. What if you are trying to match a block size that is not on the chart? They give you the calculations. So let's say I want a 21-inch block. So I would take finished block size, which is 21, times 1.414 equals 29.694, and I would add 1.25 because it tells me to. And that's 30.94. Round up, always round up. So that's going to be a 31-inch square. Perfect. So if I needed side triangles to fit a 21-inch square, I would cut it 31 inches and then cut and cut on the diagonal. And I've tested this out before. It's a formula that works. And it also, there's a formula for B for the corner triangles down here. On this particular quilt, those corner triangles are little bitty, and I think you could probably cut those from a scrap and then trim to fit. If I was actually making this quilt, I would be setting it together in units that ran diagonally across the quilt. And on these edges that are going to run long, I would just sew them long, and then I would trim off the excess fabric along the edge, lining my ruler up with these points plus 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, rather than calculate what this is exactly and cutting those off. Now you could do it differently, but if I was making this quilt, that's what I would do. Okay, I don't think I said, but I have, as I've been playing with this quilt, I've grown very fond of this setting, and I kind of want to make one, not in these colors. And even if I did make it, and even though I could do it, you know, come up with the right strip with the exact right measurement for the 45-degree cut, I probably wouldn't. I would probably cut those brown sashing strips 9 inches long, let them hang off the end, and trim them off with my ruler because it's easier. Sometimes easy is good. That does, though, put the outer edge of the brown sashing on the bias, which means you'd have to be really careful with that. But it would be on the bias anyway. That's just the way that one is. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about, because I do a lot of applique quilts, and very often when you're doing applique quilts, calculating yardage is not easy, because unless you're doing a quilt where like all the roses are the same red, or all the flowers or all the leaves, you know, where all of them are the same thing, you tell people cut from your scraps. But sometimes it adds up. So if you imagine, say, the black squares in that quilt, if they were flowers instead of squares, and they were about that size, you know, imagine an applique block, and those are round flowers, you'd still need almost a yard of fabric to get those flowers. Well, that's kind of important information. So on the quilt behind me, those pink flowers, they're big and they're all from different fabrics. But if I'm not mistaken, I had to give some sort of idea of how much yardage it took to do those. Now, it's been a while since I looked at the pattern, so I may not have, but usually I do try to give some people an idea of about how much fabric you're going to need for the applique. You know, because it makes it easier to go to your closet and choose. All right, so gosh, thank you for those of you who happened to listen to me when I wasn't making noise and stuck with me. I really appreciate it. Remember that calculating yardage is something you are fully capable of doing. There is no reason to avoid it. Excuse me. What you want to do is get yourself in the right frame of mind. Get your photograph that you're going to work from, draw it out, do whatever it is so that you know exactly what you're calculating. Get your calculator, get your very nice pencil, sharpen it to a beautiful point, have a lot of paper that you like to write on. Do your work, and when you're done, cap your beautiful pencil, set it down, and chill. And be real proud of yourself. And you really will. You'll feel proud of yourself because you can do this. So, thank you so much for sticking with me. And I hope you enjoy this. I hope you are successful in your calculations. And if anyone has a suggestion for a future topic, please do email me. I would be happy to entertain the notion. This was actually a question that was emailed to me about a week ago. So there you go. And then I will see you next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And I promise you, I will look and make sure my microphone is going at the very beginning. So thank you for taking a time out with me. And until I see you next week, may you have many happy stitches.